just when you thought it couldn't get any worse than alleged sexual predator Bryan Singer, you've got known creep and another alleged predator in Brett Ratner as he takes over to direct one of the most disappointing superhero movies ever, X-Men: The Last Stand.
Since the dawn of existence, there have always been moments when the course of history shifted. Such a turning point is upon us now.
They wish to cure us, but I say we are the cure.
A conflict between the better and worse angels of our very nature, whose outcome will change our world so greatly, there will be no going back. I do not know if victory is possible. I only know that great sacrifice will be required. And because the fate of many will depend on a few, we must make a last stand.
This is Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the Pile of Shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your other favorite podcast apps through The Real World. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review, so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at The Real World are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, here's a fun fact for you. I mentioned this when I talked about X-Men 2 going on the day of my senior prom. This was my second ever midnight screening.
Wow. I don't remember doing a midnight screening for this one because I think I was still in school, but this movie did come out like the month before I graduated high school, so it's kind of close to home too as well for me, but it's so disappointing looking back now. Like, man, like, I never realized how short this movie was, and it's short for a reason. And looking back now, it's just a complete mess. And when I watched it the first time in theaters, I enjoyed it for what it was, and I was like, okay, I thought this was like the end of the X-Men franchise, even with the little tease at the end of Magneto moving the chess piece. Funny they didn't mention Endgame, but that would have been hilarious if they mentioned the word Endgame. But yeah, it's disappointing, and at least we had Kelsey Grammer, and at least we got Kelsey Grammer as Beast, because that was probably the highlight of the movie for me.
Right, we'll get to Kelsey Grammer in just a minute, but just to give my opening salvo, this is probably one of the movies of all that we are going to review that I hate. Even more so than a lot of the movies that are already in the pile of shame. I despise this movie with a fiery passion. I don't know if my scores are necessarily going to reflect just how much I dislike this movie. But basically, I dislike this movie from the time it starts until the time it finishes, and so much of that is because Bryan Singer was not able to finish his vision, and at this time I did not know about some of his predilections, so it was very difficult for me to kind of assess things at this point. But at this point, we are in the Dark Phoenix saga. That is what Bryan Singer had conceived of and what he was going to direct. He and the 2 other writers wrote a treatment solely based on this storyline, based on the Dark Phoenix saga. This is one of the most famous storylines in the history of X-Men and in the history of Marvel comic books. It is something that I have actually read. It's one of the few graphic novels that I've read, and it is indeed one of the best that you'll ever see. And I think the animated series actually does a hell of a job matching what the comic book did. I know that you remember the X-Men animated series very fondly. Do you have any specific memories of watching both the Phoenix storyline that was 5 parts long and then the Dark Phoenix saga, which was 4 parts long?
It's weird because as a kid, like those two kind of blend in my head because I thought it was like a one saga, but it actually takes place like several episodes in between. I love the stuff where they go in space and Galandria and like how they tie in Professor X and how he can communicate as well to the aliens and the spaceship and all that kind of thing. And then you get the history of the background of actually Cyclops' dad, is actually from space. So I love that kind of, the whole saga was really well put together and those episodes were really well put together. And, that's what I was expecting, like some kind of space kind of like saga in this movie. But little did I know, even with the trailers that they gave us and what little that they showed, like I still was expecting like, well, the Phoenix is from space and she's an alien, so, they gotta go into space, right?
Unfortunately, they did not, as the script called for a deceased Jean Grey to return with a new, more destructive personality called the Phoenix. That is ultimately what happens in the movie. But in Bryan Singer's version, there would have been kind of a three-way dance, so to speak, as she would be manipulated by the Hellfire Club, including the telepath leader Emma, who would apparently have been played by Sigourney Weaver, and that is actually very intriguing. Magneto's Brotherhood, and of course the X-Men. The ending would have involved Jean committing suicide, but her spirit living on and transcending into a divine being, which is pretty bizarre, and I'm not sure if they would have gone into that direction. But ultimately, Bryan Singer was not a part of this movie. He was in the midst of a 3-picture deal with 20th Century Fox, beginning with X-Men United. He wanted to make X-Men 3, but he and Fox were unable to come to terms. And what happens is that this movie gets rushed into production, and there are a number of things that happen because of this, but we'll get to that in just a second. Warner Brothers offered Singer the chance to direct Superman Returns, a film that we have already reviewed. Singer informed Fox that he wanted to take this opportunity and also wanted to direct X-Men 3, but Fox terminated his contract. Matthew Vaughn briefly joined the production and backed out because of the chaotic timing of the productions. Brett Ratner was a finalist for the director's chair for the original X-Men that was made in 2000, and he had a rush production in Rush Hour, fittingly enough. So it was decided that he would be the director of this movie, and there are a number of other consequences that resulted. But it really bothers me that Brett Ratner directed this movie. There is no movie of his that I actually enjoy at this point. I think Rush Hour and that trilogy, yes, it certainly has a couple of great moments, but those movies, let me tell you, they have not aged very well at all.
Man, because I'm a big Rush Hour fan. Like, that was a big thing as a kid for me, and it's still it. I mean, it wasn't as big now, obviously, but I thought Rush Hour 1 was just like this big thing as a kid, man. I saw it as one of those first PG-13 movies, like going in by myself kind of thing without the parents. So Rush Hour kind of means a lot to me, but with the history and his alleged treatment of women over the years, it kind of hurt it. And what's interesting, too, is like I went to a screening like several years ago of Rush Hour, and Brett Ratner was actually there. So that was kind of interesting seeing his perspective on things, but no questions were asked about X-Men 3. But yeah, just the whole circumstances and everything behind it and the whole switcheroo with Superman Returns. It sucks, man, because my vision of this movie was so tainted. Like going into the first 15 minutes of this, and it's clear it's like a different director and it's a different vision, and it sucks, man, because as much as we don't like Bryan Singer now, at least he had a vision for this movie, like you mentioned, that kind of completed this arc. And now X-Men 3 just feels like an incomplete movie to me every time I watch it, more so every time. So that's what's really disappointing. But yeah, at least it's a few moments. But Matthew Vaughn would have directed the hell out of this movie too, I think, because his sense of style. I mean, it's a good thing they picked him for First Class, but his sense of style would have been, at least memorable for this movie.
Absolutely, and this was budgeted at $210 million, which was at the time one of the most expensive movies ever made, and part of that is because of the rush production, and the lack of care is shown on the screen by the fact that this takes place over the course of 1 hour and 45 minutes. That is how long this movie is, and so many people had very limited availability. That includes Rebecca Romaine, who plays Mystique, as she is basically within the first half hour of this movie turned into a human being, and then she departs for all intents and purposes. There's also limited availability with Anna Paquin. That is why Rogue disappears to get the mutant quote-unquote cure. She was in the midst of shooting another movie at the time of this one, so she disappears. James Marsden also, of course, disappears because he was in Superman Returns. We also had Patrick Stewart, did not necessarily have a lack of availability, but of course he gets killed about halfway through and is not seen for the rest of the movie either. So you had a lot of people who were really not able to close their loops, and I think that was a huge problem. But we almost did not have Halle Berry in this movie, which I don't know how I feel about that because I don't think that she's all that great in the first two. Anyway, she had decided not to reprise her role because there was a lack of character development, and she did not have a good relationship with Bryan Singer, which, let me tell you, is not something that is unusual. However, after Singer's departure, and fittingly because of the box office flop known as Catwoman, Barry agreed to return on the condition that her role be expanded, and indeed, she replaces Cyclops as the team leader of the X-Men, and which keeps up with the comic books, where for a time she did serve as a team leader in both Cyclops and Xavier's absence. So we did get a little bit more with Halle Berry, and of course Kelsey Grammer, who was so excited to play Beast, and it was kind of surprising reading about the fact that he was so excited to play this comic book character. He even agreed to an audition for this role, and of course at this time he is just coming off basically playing Frasier Crane for 20 consecutive years across the last 8 seasons of Cheers and the 11 seasons of Frasier. So it's pretty remarkable that Kelsey Grammer had that kind of a run and then goes and basically goes right into this comic book movie. And this is the first time that he have auditioned in about 20 years, and he has gone on record saying that Beast is one of his favorite roles of his career, and even did a last-minute cameo in Days of the Future Past, which we will talk about more in a couple weeks. But any thoughts on either Halle Berry or Kelsey Grammer before we get into the movie itself?
It's so obvious that they gave Halle Berry much more to do in this. She's much more of a leader, and I like that. That's what she should have been in the second one, at least, you know. And I know that they want Scott to be the leader and blah, 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 and he is kind of the leader of the main team, at least what we're used to, right? But to me, Storm is more of a leader, you know, and her personality is a lot better in this one, even though there's still some lacking and some energy kind of problems there. But that's kind of like, you know, she's been there, done that, and I think she, at this point, she was kind of collecting the paycheck, obviously, based on the history and the flop that was Catwoman. So, but we know when I heard Kelsey Grammer was cast as Beast, I thought that was like one of those perfect castings, man. Like, you know, Wolverine with Hugh Jackman was a perfect casting. Another one I like to do is Fred Flintstone with John Goodman, perfect casting. To me, like, Kelsey Grammer sounds like exactly like Beast should sound. Like, that voice of Frasier Crane is like the perfect Beast voice to me, and I thought that was so perfect. And every time he was on screen and talking, I loved it. And you know, around this time, like Nick at Night was running all those, you know, Cheers reruns, and I really got into Cheers, you know, around this time, and I'm still a big Cheers fan, and I love Frasier Crane's character. And there's even this moment that we'll talk about later, but it's such a Frasier Crane moment that he has, and I know you think I know you know what I'm talking about. That it was just like a kind of like a you know, a call to his Frasier Crane-ness, basically. But I love what he did with the role, and I love that they did the full Beast look. And I just feel something's lacking with the Beast character in the newer movies, with the newer portrayal. But to me, like, Kelsey Grammer is just that pitch perfect casting.
Yeah, I appreciate Nicholas Hoult at times, but he's no Kelsey Grammer. He does not have the voice. He does not have the personality, the theatrical personality that so many others have. Let's talk about the heroes, because among the heroes and the villains, this is just a movie where everybody is consistently making terrible decisions. Let's talk about Cyclops first, since he is not in this movie very much. We see very little of James Marsden. He's essentially in 2 scenes, one of which he is interacting with Wolverine. and he is still broken up about Jean Grey. Clearly, some time has passed. One of the big questions that I had about Cyclops, Brian, is was anyone counseling him? Was there a therapist somewhere? How is Cyclops still this depressed to the point where he literally cannot exist?
Yeah, I thought like they would have provided him some good care and some good therapy because everyone seemed to be kind of like over it. Even Storm was just like, man, I can't believe how hard like this death hit him. But like at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if like he was haunted by Jean Grey's voice that kind of haunted him at the beginning. So I can give him that, or he's just like kind of haunted by her voice because she keeps haunting him in his dreams because she's still alive. I can buy into that. But other than that, like he was just kind of like a depressed dick, and it's just like, man, you were never likable in the first two movies, and now you're way less likable now.
I mean, I think the biggest issue with Cyclops, they have done a grave injustice to this character, and I think some people would argue that they kind of did the same thing on the animated series by making him a square. But in this, he's barely in X-Men 2. In fact, he gets the Hawkeye treatment, as we talked about last week. But here, he's in these two scenes, and there's no emotional investment, even in the scene when Cyclops and Jean get together. Are we supposed to feel something about this couple? Because a lot of the focus has been much more on Wolverine and Jean than it has on Cyclops and Jean, and it's just so bizarre to me that we are supposed to care about Cyclops and be invested in the fact that he dies. We don't even see a body. We don't even know if he's officially dead because Jean Grey does a really good job of dusting people, which we know where Thanos got that idea from, but. We'll get to some of the dusting in just a couple minutes, but I want to talk about Xavier next because, oh my God, did they do a grave injustice to this character. I mean, it is offensive, the material that they give Patrick Stewart in this movie, because he apparently has blocked aspects of Jean's personality without her consent. He doubles down on this decision and dies because of it, because he continues to try to convince Jean that this is the right decision and that he wants to, again, block this aspect of who Jean Grey is. Then at the end of the movie, he apparently takes over somebody's conscience unwillingly. There's also a point when he yells at Wolverine for going to talk to Jean and trying to help Jean for no reason. I absolutely hated the way that Xavier was portrayed in this movie, and the fact that he dies the way that he does just adds to my frustration because it looks really terrible. Even in 2006, it just looks really bad. And Patrick Stewart, you could give Patrick Stewart a lot, but there is nothing that he could have done to redeem the character in this movie. It's really, really bad.
It's weird too because in the classroom scene, he's talking about ethics, about that kind of thing that he does, and then he goes and does it without even questioning it. But the idea of taking over the dead or the comatose body and kind of moving your consciousness to another body and blah blah blah. Yeah, it's weird that he talked about it ethically and just ended up doing it. And then that scene where he gets obliterated, I watched that again, and I'm just like, man, like, why are you even doing that? Like, there's no reason to do that. And then it's just like it goes on, and then Magneto's just standing there, and then the whole idea of the Magneto Professor X relationship, this movie kind of like destroys that for me. You watch the relationship in this movie, and Magneto just acts like nothing, and he doesn't care that Xavier just got obliterated in front of him, and he just like walks away with Jean Grey, like no emotion. He doesn't give a shit that his best friend just got obliterated in front of him. It's so weird, that scene, and like the way Magneto reacts to it. I don't know. And then yeah, that's pretty much all that Xavier does, and then all the main dialogue kind of switches to Storm and Wolverine for the heroes. So it's really disappointing. The more we talk about it, I think I'm going to lower my score as we talk about it.
Right. I mean, I think this movie is borderline indefensible. I appreciate the fact that Storm does have more to do, but she's the leader that nobody listens to. Wolverine does not listen to her. Cyclops does not listen to her. Xavier really doesn't. Jean Grey doesn't. So you have somebody who does have a bigger role. And I understand where Halle Berry's coming from. I mean, this is a character. She is the only woman of color of any significance in this movie. And the reality is that Storm is a very important character from the animated series, of course, from the comic books. For 40 years at this point, Storm, Aurora Monroe, has been so important. And the way that she has been treated in these three movies, and even into X-Men Apocalypse, is pretty ridiculous in my mind, because this is a franchise that purports to be about a group of people, in this case mutants, who are being marginalized. And throughout the history of the X-Men franchise, people of color are consistently marginalized in this franchise. And the most egregious example actually takes place next week when we talk about X-Men First Class. But to me, this is a perfect example of X-Men not living up to its ideals. And again, Halle Berry has more to do, but in some ways she feels just as impotent as she does in the first two movies.
Yeah, exactly. And you can tell by her energy level that it kind of exemplifies that. And it sucks because you're right, like it should be like she should be like a major character that we should be emotionally attached to, and we don't get that at all, even after three movies, you know what I mean? So it sucks the way they, treat her, and then even, well, we'll talk about it in Days of Futures Past, but even then, I think it was just kind of lacking there as well, even for Halle Berry. So,
Brian, we still have to talk about Wolverine, Rogue, and the kids. That's how much I hate this movie. I really feel the need not to dwell on the hatred, but it's really important to me that I illustrate all of the reasons that this movie is really bad, because I need to vent, Brian. This is 13 years of pent up frustration coming out. So, if you will bear with me, I do want to talk about Wolverine. He has no focus. He's clearly the favorite, but he's not a great leader either. And they give him the big rousing speech at the end. And one of the things that has consistently bothered me is that they have all these students, they have all these X-Men across the first two movies, and how many X-Men are fighting at the end in the big final battle?
yeah, just like four new X-Men that they've been training, and not even the cool ones. They set up Jubilee. We didn't even get Jubilee as one of the X-Men at the end. I mean, they built up all these different, all these little cameos in the background of the first two movies at the school, and they give us these guys, and they're not even ready yet. So, yeah, the way they put it together at the end and showing these new X-Men, wasn't really feeling it. I thought, like, even they said it, like, they're not ready to be out there, and yet they throw them out there because they got no one left. So, and I'm talking about the kids with, like, Bobby and Kitty Pryde. They're not even, not even graduated high school yet, and they're out there fighting for the X-Men. So I mixed feelings on that. I wish they would have had more of established names. This would have been a great time to throw in a Gambit, I think, like a fully adult Gambit, not a kid Gambit. But again, I see your frustrations in the characters. And Wolverine, overall, I felt like, you mentioned him being a bad leader. He should have killed Jean Grey right there on the table, man. She told him to kill him, and he could have saved a bunch of lives, and he didn't because he fell in love with someone else's girl who's married. So that's kind of my feelings on that whole relationship.
Right. The way that relationship is portrayed is really bad, and they've tried to kind of retcon it into something not so bad, even in some of the future Wolverine movies, which we'll get into. But I'm sorry, I just have had a real issue with that relationship, and it only gets worse the more I see it. Anna Paquin was such an important part of the first movie. She really does not get a lot to do in the second movie. Here in the third movie, again, of her reduced role, the main plot of this movie is that there is a cure, and Rogue literally only wants to take the cure because she wants to fuck Bobby Drake. And that is made clear in a scene with Rogue and Wolverine, which actually on its surface is a well done scene because Wolverine and Rogue have this history. So there is actually some pathos in this scene. But when Wolverine asks Rogue why she wants to do it, she kind of looks around, and it is made absolutely clear that the only reason she wants to do this is because of her boyfriend, and that sucks. That is bad writing, because there's a way to do it. There's a way to have Rogue want to take the cure that doesn't suck. When Xavier is talking about ethics and morality, like the ethics and morality of Rogue touching people and killing them if she takes too much of their energy, that is something that could have been done well. It could have been made legitimate, and you could have seen the argument for why Rogue wants to take the cure. But ultimately, and even in the last scene where Rogue and Bobby hold hands, that's the reason that she wants to get this cure, and I think that sucks.
Yeah, same feelings there. And then she kind of disappears, like you said, for the rest of the movie when she could have been there at the end, really fighting in the main battle. But yeah, the way that was portrayed, and it's just the way Bobby looked really bad. Like it looked really bad doing that stuff with Kitty Pryde, and like deep down, come on, man. If you got a girlfriend, you shouldn't be doing that at all. But he got caught, knowing that he probably was going to get caught because it's such a big school too. So just mixed feelings there as well with that whole ice skating scene.
And I really like Ellen Page. I think she's done some very good work. And there are a couple scenes where she is Kitty Pryde that I give her a ton of credit for making this role something even decent. I really actually like the scene and the ingenuity that Kitty uses when she saves the little boy at the end and it involves the Juggernaut. I really like her interactions with the Juggernaut, and I do not like the Juggernaut as a character, which we'll get into in just a minute, but I think Ellen Page actually does something with this role, even though her existence is solely for this love triangle and not a whole lot else. I'm going to have a lot more complaining about Kitty Pryde in X-Men Days of the Future Past, but I do want to end on a positive note and just say Beast is the best part of this movie. He was a breath of fresh air, and the only reason that I do not give this a pile of shame level score is because of his performance, and I think Hugh Jackman is just good enough to not give this a 2. I am giving this a score of 3.
Well, I'm going with a 5, and just to mention with Kelsey Grammer, that one scene where he's like talking with Wolverine mid-fight, and he goes, "Well, you get the point." That is such a Fraser Crane moment that like that popped me. You know what I mean? I didn't pick up on that when I was younger, but looking back now, like that is such a Fraser Crane moment that kind of like popped me enough to keep it at a 5 for me and not anything below that.
Right, and it popped me too. And again, I think that it is worth mentioning that everybody is making terrible decisions, but it's not just the heroes making bad decisions. Oh, it's the villains too. Magneto is so cruel in this movie. And yes, I understand that he is an antagonist, that he is not a good person, but he's tyrannical. He's Hitler-like. I think that's the vibe that they're clearly going for. He doesn't care about Mystique after she becomes a human being. He basically abandons this naked woman on the truck. I have a real issue with that, given the loyalty that they had exhibited to each other in the first 2 movies, and the way that he comments on her by saying that she was so beautiful. Oh, that's also terrible and very sexist writing. He doesn't mourn Charles Xavier after Xavier is killed and just immediately brings Jean onto his side. And I know that Charles Xavier and Magneto have been on the opposite side of the spectrum as far as their views, but they were portrayed as being friends. And even the first scene of this movie, they are friends. They are supposed to be kind of these tragic Martin Luther King, Malcolm X standbys. And instead, Magneto is just horrible in this movie. He holds Jean back from doing anything in the final battle until the very end. He refers to his fellow mutants as pawns. This is just awful. I hated what they did to Magneto in this. And again, I think Ian McKellen is doing all he can, even with the big rousing speech that he gives in the forest. But my goodness, is this awful.
It's very inconsistent. It's very like, yeah, the way you said that about Xavier's like the same way I felt. Like they really just ignored all that like history and the relationship, and he just, he shows no remorse or like no emotion when he dies right in front of him in the most brutal way possible too. So it's just kind of like shocking. And then like you said, like he's treating the mutants like pawns, man. I was just like, man, I don't know if Magneto from X-Men 2 would even do that. It's just inconsistent writing on the characters, and what the other thing too is just like at the end, just I don't know, like the way that he put that plan together just seems so like the first one, and then just the idea of him wanting to kill the Cure, kill the kid. I don't know. It just seems like they've been, setting up this war, and I guess that was the idea, that they were leading into the war, but then it was just one stupid battle in Alcatraz. The way that they built it up with Magneto, it's just, it didn't feel like that was his grand plan. Like, it felt like there should have been some kind of resolution between him and Xavier in this last part, part of the trilogy, and kind of like them getting together and fighting the big fight. But obviously they didn't do that, and made it even more contrived. And then the idea that Jean Grey God, she has no like motivation. This whole Phoenix character, right? Like at least give us a reason why you want to kill all these people and why you like want this power and blah blah blah. And there's like no motivation for her. She's just there to like go crazy and go crazy with powers until Wolverine has to kill her at the end. And she has like no reason to do any of the things she does. She has no reason to kill Scott. She has no reason to like kill Xavier, right? But she does it for no reason at all, and there's no explanation for it. So that's really frustrating to watch that, and then just to have her die again. It sucks. The way they treated her. Like, at least give some explanation as to the reasoning behind this other personality, and like some traits of this other personality that that's been locked away for years apparently, that she didn't even know about, and just so many things that they could have gone into detail with that they didn't do. And they just wanted her, to look, kind of skimpy and sexy, and then have long red hair and blow people up.
Right. I think the problem is that they changed things so much from both the comics and the animated series, because the idea of Phoenix is not that she has always been a part of Jean Grey, but that she comes into Jean Grey's body because of what happens in space. I think that's the whole concept behind it, and I think that there is a way to do that story, but you have to put the work in, and they have not put any of the work in with Jean Grey. And I think the fact that they did not develop these characters enough in the first two movies really proves to be a fatal flaw, because there's no incentive to care about Jean Grey or Phoenix, and I don't think Famke Jensen is all that good in this movie. I think she was very monotone and lacked a lot of personality in the second one. In this, I just don't think she's very good. I don't know if that's how much of that is her. I undoubtedly a lot of it is the writing, because she isn't given a whole lot to do beyond threatening people, telling people to kill her, and stare at people to death. But it's very poor. I do want to hit on some of the minor characters, as Pyro, who turned evil in the second movie. He and Iceman have a face-off that I guess is supposed to pay off their feud. Iceman goes into kind of the Iceman form for the first time, which is kind of a big deal for this franchise. But like we joked last week, there really is no payoff for Pyro in this movie. Juggernaut, who is played by Vinnie Jones, and so one of the things that we talked about, I believe this was what in our Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse review, was talking about memes coming into the big screen. I think this is the very first example of kind of an online meme or video coming into a movie, because the Juggernaut says, "I am the Juggernaut, bitch," to Kitty Pryde, which is the second example of a character referring to a female character as a bitch, by the way. But the Juggernaut says that, and it is so out of place and so bad. And the Juggernaut is reduced to a punchline, and I think it's representative of all the movie's problems.
Yeah, Juggernaut, man, what a waste. Because like, you could have put any like generic X-Men villain in that role; it would have been the same thing. And the idea that like Juggernaut, isn't Juggernaut supposed to be Xavier's brother? Like that's the big thing, right? I'm not crazy. Like that's the big thing.
Right. That is something that both the comic books and the animated series maintained, was that Kane Marco was Xavier's half brother, and in this movie he's just a random dude that, just like what they did with Sabretooth, they removed all backstory and he's just there. And that is something that I think that this franchise can be accused of, is they have these characters there with their powers, but there is no solid background to them. And there's going to be other examples as well. I mean, Trask is in this movie, and it's a name, but just like Khan in Star Trek Into Darkness, it doesn't mean anything, because Trask is not fulfilling the same purpose here as he is in the animated series and the comic books.
And when you mention Trask, not to mention that he's an adult black male, and that he's recast later in a different. And, I mean, it's the same role, I guess? I don't know. It was supposed to be the same role, but then this whole idea of this new X-Men universe being reborn kind of changed things, and then you got to recast with, what's his name? The guy who plays Tyrion, Peter Dinklage. And just that idea that they went from this version of Trask to this version of Trask shows the inconsistencies. You know what I mean? Like, this idea that the X-Men movies have to keep continuing no matter what, and no matter how inconsistent the timeline gets. It gets frustrating, especially when you look back and see how Trask was this other complete dude, and that they recast the role completely later and changed it completely later, just for the sake of to fit the current storyline that they wanted to tell. I don't know. It's just frustrating looking back at like all these timeline changes. And then with Angel, we forget to mention Angel in the hero score. But Angel's in this movie and he's like a kid. But then we meet him like in the newer movies and he's like in the 80s. So I don't know, man.
We are not going to adjudicate the X-Men timeline because that would be a complete mess, and we literally don't have time for that. The fact that Angel is in this movie, played by Ben Foster, who's a really good actor, and is almost given nothing to do, I think is a major indictment. Callisto is in this movie, and despite the fact that in the first two movies, levels of mutants have never been introduced, but here they talk about it openly, like we're supposed to know what they're talking about. And Callisto apparently has like multiple mutant powers. It's just really bizarre to me. And my villain score, I settled on a 3. I almost feel like I'm being generous with that score, but again, I think that there are some solid performances, even amidst some of the real issues that this movie has. So I settled on a score of 3, which is still not great.
I'm going with a 4. The villains to me are not laughable. It's just frustrating watching it unfold and kind of figuring out their motivations and knowing that the way we perceive Magneto and even Mystique to an extent, and then all of a sudden they change these characters and the way they act and the way they're motivated. It just was really frustrating.
All right, let's talk about the story. So this movie not only tries to get the Phoenix storyline but they also have The Cure, which is based off of a Joss Whedon story, Gifted, which took place in the first 6 issues of The Astonishing X-Men. And it was also something that was done in X-Men, the animated series, in the first season. But of course, The Cure is such an important aspect of the Final Battle 2. We open with back-to-back flashbacks, which is never a good sign. It's bad enough when you have one flashback, but here we have 2, and in the opening flashback, we get both Stan Lee and Chris Claremont as they have their cameos. This was the cameo that the Academy Awards decided to use as part of their death montage. This is the one that they chose for Stan Lee. Of course, not one of his best ones, but he certainly is there. We also see Angel trying to hack off some of his wings, which was a great concept, but didn't really have a whole lot of follow-up. It is one of the few legacies of the Matthew Vaughn version of this film. And then things just kind of go boom, boom, boom. There really is not a lot of character development. As we mentioned before, this movie's about 1 hour and 45 minutes. And we get some stuff with the Worthingtons. We get some stuff with the Cure. They tease the Sentinels in the Danger Room, and this was apparently supposed to be a really big deal, but it kind of didn't go over very well when all we saw was a Sentinel head. We get Cyclops dying, we get Xavier dying. Really, the only person that talks to Cyclops about his issues is Wolverine, and that's not the best person to do that. When Jean kills people, she dusts them, which is pretty trippy given what we know now. And there's a lot of really bad dialogue in this movie. We get, again, multiple instances of referring to female characters as bitches. We get the president talking about hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, which is also not a great line given who the director of this movie is. The final battle includes one of the most egregious continuity errors of all time, as San Francisco goes from morning to dark when Magneto moves the bridge. Do you remember that?
I thought it just went from like twilight, 5 p.m. to darkness, but if you're saying that was the morning, that's even more hilarious. And the fact that the bridge actually didn't collapse after he moved the bridge is even more kind of mind-blowing to me.
And of course you get the final battle, which I think is very blandly shot, and the fact that the U.S. Army is just using the Cure shots, and it's so clunky because Jean isn't involved, because if Jean becomes involved, basically it's over right away, but for dramatic purposes, they hold her back, and it's very bad, and you only have 6 X-Men there. I think like I said, there are a couple of nice moments that involve Kitty Pryde and the Juggernaut. Even with Wolverine and Jean, I think they do their best to make the best of a bad situation. But this story, from beginning to end, is a mess, and we don't really get an idea of the characters. We don't really get an explanation, for example, why Nightcrawler isn't there. We get the destruction of these relationships. We have characters being written out because of their commitments to other movies. So again, I'm going with my same score of a 3.
I'm gonna give it a 5. I just feel like there's a lot of like decent stuff there. Like I love that part with the only part I like a lot is that thing with Angel at the beginning because that's kind of like such a disturbing scene. But that seemed like to have some real emotion to it, especially with the acting with that kid. But other than that, like it just kind of falls apart like right off the bat. Just some frustrating things like if Scott dies, how come they didn't have a funeral for him? Like you know what I mean? Like they knew that they killed him and they didn't have a funeral for him, yet they had a funeral for Xavier in the small amount of time that they did. Just weird stuff like that. And then the whole idea that Angel just shows up randomly and then just saves his dad at the end randomly, and then other than that, like had no other ties to the X-Men at all. Like I don't know, just a lot of random stuff and like you said, just treatment of the characters, and it gets very frustrating. But the reason I give it a 5 is because at least they had some decent ideas that they kind of tried with and kind of played with, but again, because of the poor directing of Brett Ratner, it just didn't really execute.
Right. And again, how does Angel get from New York to San Francisco when it took the X-Men forever to get from New York to San Francisco using the Blackbird? There's just a lot of really bad stuff in this movie. The Mystique stuff is also pretty ridiculous, but I don't even want to dwell on that because I feel like we're going long on this anyway. So I want to move into the technical aspects. Look, these suits are still awful because they're leather and dark. The score is barely there. I think the script is really bad on a dialogue level. I think the movie is shot very blandly. I don't think there's anything memorable. For the most part, I don't think it's necessarily bad the way that it's shot because you can still see everything. You can see the final battle. I don't think there's anything too egregious, but I just think it's mostly bland, and that is why I settled on a score of 5 for the technical aspects of this movie.
This is gonna be my highest score, and I don't know if it's gonna be controversial or not, but I'm gonna give it a 7 just because I think that scene in the house where Jean does obliterate Xavier, that did look really good because the way that they shot it, like they had to do some trick shots, where they're shooting the set upside down kind of thing, where they have to do an upside down shot, and little things they did with the house, and then the way that she was obliterating people, like turning them to dust. That kind of looked kind of cool to me because just seeing, like you said, it's kind of trippy to see now that Thanos does it, and to see it then actually is kind of like whoa. You think about like how crazy that is to disintegrate someone in front of you into just dust. So I'll give it a 7. I do like the score a little more. For some reason, the score kind of sticks with me a little bit just because I think that theme at the end that plays when, Wolverine kills Jean Grey, that kind of sticks with me a little bit. So that'll be my highest score. And, I still hate the suits. But it was so funny, too, the way that they kind of hinted at the old suits when Beast puts on his old vest. I thought that was a nice little hint with the nice little yellow, hints there, or, with the lining of the suit. So I thought that was a nice little callback to the original suits.
As far as the legacy of this movie goes, this is a franchise killer. Even though it was one of the most successful movies of 2006, this was almost universally reviled because of the potential of X-Men 2, but then seeing what this turned out. I think there are people that still wanted to see some redemption, and I think that is undoubtedly a part of this movie's legacy, is the fact that they were ultimately able to get some of that. And again, I personally hate this movie more than almost anything that is in the pile of shame, even though the score is ultimately going to be much higher than some of those. So I had a really hard time coming up with a legacy score, so I'm going to settle on a 4.
That's my score as well. I just feel like some of the stuff that is in this movie is kind of like echoed out in the later movies, like when we'll talk about it coming up when we talk about the Wolverine episode. They really tie in the Jean Grey stuff, so that kind of still has a legacy to that. And then just some of the things that do happen in this movie kind of have some continuity within the timeline itself, despite how much the timeline is convoluted and crazy now. But they still refer to Wolverine being haunted by Jean Grey's death in later movies, so it has some significance to it, and that kind of still sticks. But other than that, that's the only thing that kind of lingers from X-Men 3 and the other movies.
All right, so I settled on a score of 15, which is definitely not worthy of being put into the pile of shame because your score is
25. It's not as bad as yours, but it's just kind of some middle ground stuff. But I think the tech score kind of helped because I appreciated some of the stuff they did.
The fact that this movie got as high as a 40 is really, really surprising to me because I definitely thought that we were going to be in the 30s on this one, but you are a much more forgiving person than I am, obviously.
I mean, I'm just glad it was shorter and not, where something like Electro, where we watched a couple months ago, just like, God, that was shorter but felt longer, you know what I mean? So in this case, like, it kind of moved at a certain pace where I didn't feel like it was dragging at times, but it did leave you wanting more, obviously, for some character development.
All right, well, let's get to the burning questions. Brian, we have reviewed Superman Returns and now X-Men The Last Stand. What's better?
X-Men The Last Stand, because it's like the opposite for me. You have a hatred for this movie, and I have some kind of weird hatred for Superman Returns, so it's kind of swapped there. So I'm going with Last Stand because I definitely find them more enjoyable and easier to sit through for me.
I think Superman Returns actually has some ideas. I think it has some much better action sequences. I always think about the airplane scene, which is better than anything that is in X-Men The Last Stand. So on this, we are going to disagree. I don't think we're arguing that either one is a classic, but I would definitely, if you asked me which I would watch again, I would watch Superman Returns by choice, more so than X-Men The Last Stand. How did the animated series do the storyline better than a major feature film?
Well, they had the time to invest, and like we said, like it's two different storylines they did, Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix. So they had that time to build it in between the seasons. So you just, you need that time to build up the characters and build that relationship, and they try to do that, but because of the short change they gave the other characters in X-Men 1 and 2, you couldn't build that relationship, so.
What is the biggest missed opportunity from this entire trilogy? And I'm asking kind of about not just this movie, but we are kind of coming to the end of kind of the first part of this X-Men franchise. So what is kind of the biggest thing that you would have liked to have seen? And again, you're not just assessing this movie, but the whole of the first three movies.
What I was expecting by the end of X-Men 3 is to have that like look and aesthetic that was close to the 90s show where you get all the heroes finally built up and like sticking together as a team, because when we first saw Wolverine, he was not a member of the X-Men. He was just kind of coming through and then eventually kind of joined them sporadically, right? What I wanted was that full team by the end where you had like Beast and Wolverine and Cyclops and all of them together and Storm and even have like finally getting Gambit in there, like that's what I wanted, and get closer to that look. And maybe the look was going to evolve throughout the movies, but it really didn't. And that's what I really wanted, that aesthetic that the 90s show gave me.
I think the biggest thing that was lacking for me was the lack of character development, and I think the two characters that were most hurt by this were Cyclops and Storm. These are two of the most important characters in the history of the X-Men, and they are going to need some serious redemption. It's worth noting that Kevin Feige was a co-producer on X-Men 2. He is listed as an executive producer for this movie. So Kevin Feige clearly has a passion. He clearly is going to want to do a lot of things with this franchise, and I hope that one of the biggest thing that I think he needs to do is to build up all of the other characters again besides Wolverine. Question 4, was Famke Jensen the right choice to play Jean Grey? Because I don't think so. I do not think she is good in this movie, and I think this is where they needed her to be good. And I do think a part of it, again, is the writing. I don't think it helps, but I really think she's bad in this movie.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't know what it is, but like she's like so much better in that James Bond movie than all these X-Men movies looking back, man. And it's the energy level. I don't know if it's the directing of the character as well. We just mix that in together, and it just doesn't fit. And I don't know, like, if this current incarnation is good as well. I don't know if I'm just bored with the character, like, on screen at this point because of the way they've treated the character, but I feel like Jean Grey really needs to get, like, not made a makeover, so to speak, but, like, a character kind of rehaul and a redux and make her less boring, because I was getting the same kind of boring vibes even in X-Men Apocalypse, so they got to really figure things out, otherwise this last movie's really going to, like, really, really suck.
Spoiler alert, my guess is it's going to really, really suck.
Yeah, I hate to say that, but I kind of agree. But I really don't want that, especially the way that they treated this, Jean Grey character over the years.
All right, on a scale of 1 to 10, how excited were you for another X-Men movie after this one?
I would say like a 3, because I thought it was completely done at this point. Even with the little tease at the end, I thought we were going to get no more X-Men movies for a while. And then And then they, did the whole X-Men Origins idea, and that just kind of like really, I thought that was going to kill the X-Men for sure after that. But luckily, First Class, kind of saved it. But after this movie, I was kind of done with it. Even with the introduction and the announcement of Origins, like I wasn't fully sold on it then. And looking back now, like First Class really saved the franchise.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you on that. I would probably go a little bit higher and say a 4 because I was hopeful that the Wolverine movie would be good. Little did I know that it would be really, really bad. And that is a movie that we've already reviewed, and you'll probably get a chance to listen to our review of it in the next couple weeks. But in just thinking about this movie, it's just ridiculous in my mind that this trilogy ended up the way that it did, and it's really unfortunate because I think there was an opportunity to make this kind of the first really important and impactful trilogy, and it really wasn't. And the funny thing is that The Last Stand is a weird creature of its own time because this is a movie that is coming out just a year after Batman Begins, but it's 2 years before the MCU has even started at this point. So it's such a weird thing to go back and look at. But ultimately, I think X-Men Last Stand is one of the most disappointing movies that we have ever talked about on this podcast as far as superhero movies go. And what we are going to be doing next week is we are going to replay the episode where we discussed X-Men Origins Wolverine, so you will get to hear us discuss the kind of the rock bottom point for the X-Men. We recorded that episode last year, so I'm going to attach it to our episode next week. But next week, Brian, we are going to be talking about an X-Men team-up movie that may in fact be the best one, First Class.
Yeah, and man, Matthew Vaughn should have directed all the X-Men movies after that, but this definitely has the best style, and at the time, I was a big fan of Kick-Ass when it came out, and when I found out he was directing this, I knew that it's going to have a distinct visual style, and I was right, and he had the right soundtrack idea for it too, and he had that right 60s feel, and he was the perfect guy for that movie. We'll talk about it next week.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that one. Of course, X-Men 2 is in the Pantheon. I have a feeling that First Class might also make it as well, but we will see how it all shakes out. For Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. We will talk to you next week.
Sometimes, I don't know, I got nothing. I was going to do the Cheers line, but then I realized it didn't fit. So I guess nothing on this one.